Nobody expected Pam Bondi to walk into a hostile firestorm and come out completely untouched. The audience inside the high-end Manhattan studio was buzzing. It was a primetime political talk show, and tonight they had a special guest, one that half the room wanted to tear apart. Attorney General Pam Bondi. Her invitation to the show wasn't a friendly gesture. It was a setup. The host, Mark Holloway, was a well-known liberal firebrand, a man who prided himself on exposing corruption and holding conservatives accountable. He wasn't interested in fair debate. He was there to humiliate, attack, and destroy. And tonight, his target was Bondi. As the cameras rolled, Holloway leaned forward in his chair, his expression sharp, smug, and filled with anticipation. Sitting across from him, Pam Bondi remained perfectly composed. She had walked into a trap, and yet she didn't look like a woman who felt trapped. Holloway's opening monologue was brutal. "Welcome back to the show," he began, flashing a rehearsed grin at the camera. "Tonight we have a very special guest, Attorney General Pam Bondi. Now, unless you've been living under a rock, you know her as the controversial legal figure who has been at the center of multiple scandals, questionable prosecutions, and of course, her undeniable ties to one of the most corrupt administrations in history." The audience chuckled, some outright clapping. Pam didn't react. Holloway turned to her, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of battle. "Pam, thank you for being here," he said, his voice carrying the faintest trace of condescension. Pam tilted her head slightly, offering a polite but unreadable smile. "Happy to be here, Mark," she said, her tone calm, measured. Holloway leaned in slightly, eager to strike first. "Let's cut the pleasantries," he said. "I want to get straight to the point. You've been accused of abusing your power, protecting corrupt politicians, and targeting opponents for political gain." Pam raised an eyebrow. "That's quite the introduction." Holloway smirked. "Well, let's be honest. You haven't exactly been a champion of justice, have you?" The audience laughed. Pam didn't even blink. "Is there a question in there? Or are you just enjoying the sound of your own voice?" she asked. A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Holloway's smirk twitched. He was not used to pushback. "All right," he said, gripping his desk slightly. "Let's talk specifics. There are reports that your office has refused to investigate high-profile figures with deep political connections. In some cases, people have outright accused you of taking bribes." The audience gasped, a few people even cheering. Pam still didn't react. Instead, she slowly crossed one leg over the other and folded her hands in her lap. "Bribes?" she repeated. Holloway nodded aggressively. "Yes, I mean, come on, Pam. You have received thousands in political donations from individuals and groups that later benefited from your office's lack of action. If that's not corruption, what is?" Pam finally let out a soft chuckle. Holloway froze. It wasn't the reaction he had expected. Pam tilted her head slightly. "Mark," she said, "are you asking me a question, or are you just hoping to hear applause from the people who agree with you?" The audience stilled. Holloway faltered for just a second. Pam continued, "Because from where I'm sitting, this doesn't look like an interview," she said, her voice cool but razor sharp. "It looks like a performance, and if that's the case, I don't mind playing along. Just let me know whether you actually want answers, or if this is just your chance to grandstand for the cameras." A few people in the audience gasped. A handful of scattered claps rang out. Holloway's smile stiffened. Pam leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with him. "If you'd like an answer, I'd be happy to provide one," she said. Holloway shifted slightly in his seat, but he wasn't about to let her take control of the narrative. "Fine," he said, his voice a little tighter. "Answer this. Why have you refused to pursue cases that could hold powerful people accountable?" Pam smiled. "Do you mean the way your network refused to report on certain cases when it was politically inconvenient?" The audience stirred. Holloway's expression tightened. Pam's tone remained polite, almost playful. "You seem very passionate about corruption, Mark," she said. "So let me ask you something. Where was this passion when your network refused to cover certain investigations that didn't fit the narrative they wanted?" Holloway opened his mouth, then shut it. The audience leaned in. Pam didn't let up. "Because I find it interesting," she continued, that the only corruption that ever seems to matter to you is the kind that helps your side politically. The tension in the room was palpable. Holloway cleared his throat. Pam smiled. "Let me make something clear," she said. "My job isn't to please you. It's not to make your network happy. My job is to uphold the law, even when it's inconvenient for people like you." The audience erupted. Some clapped. Others booed. But no one was silent. Holloway leaned back slightly in his chair. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of a takedown. And Pam? She just sat there looking completely unfazed. The studio was on fire. The audience was still buzzing, some cheering, others murmuring uncomfortably. But not a single person was silent. Pam Bondi had just flipped the entire interview upside down, and Mark Holloway felt it. For the first time in his career, he was losing control of the conversation, but he wasn't going down without a fight. He forced a tight smile, gripping his cue cards a little harder. "You're deflecting," he said, leaning forward again, trying to regain the upper hand. "This isn't about my network. This is about your office's record." Pam tilted her head as if she were indulging a child. "Oh, my record?" she asked smoothly. "By all means, Mark, tell me about my record. Let's see if you actually did your homework, or if you're just here to push a pre-written narrative." Holloway's smirk twitched. The studio lights felt hotter now. A few people in the audience laughed. Pam just sat there, perfectly composed. Holloway straightened his papers, buying himself a second. "All right," he said. "Let's talk facts. Under your leadership, your office has—" Pam held up a hand. "No, Mark, let's talk actual facts," she interrupted. The audience gasped. Holloway's jaw clenched. Pam leaned forward slightly, her voice sharp but controlled. "You want to accuse me of corruption? Fine, but don't just throw out accusations and hope people clap. Bring the receipts." The audience stirred. Holloway blinked. "Excuse me?" Pam folded her hands on the table. "You want to make a case? Make one," she said. "Give me one example of a case I mishandled. Name it, right now." Silence. Holloway froze. Pam waited. The audience leaned in. 5 seconds passed, then 10. Holloway shifted uncomfortably. Pam smiled. "You see, Mark," she continued, her voice laced with calm authority, "it's easy to sit behind a desk and throw out words like corrupt or unethical. It gets you applause. It gets you clips that go viral. But when you actually have to back it up, that's where people like you fall apart." A wave of murmurs spread through the audience. Pam kept going. "If you had real evidence of corruption in my office, you wouldn't be here playing word games. You'd be showing documents, citing sources, doing actual journalism." Holloway's face tightened. Pam tilted her head. "But you're not." The audience was hooked. Pam sat back, completely at ease. "Because you don't have a case, all you have is clickbait." The audience exploded. Some cheered, some booed, but nobody was neutral. Pam Bondi had just flipped the entire show against its own host. And Holloway knew it. His cheeks flushed. He was out of rehearsed questions. He was out of scripted talking points. And worst of all, Pam wasn't just winning. She was enjoying it. Holloway adjusted his tie, scrambling for a way out. "Well, he stammered, "I think what viewers at home really want to know is—" Pam leaned forward again. "Viewers at home," she said, cutting him off, "want the truth." The audience cheered again. Pam turned toward them, her voice clear, steady, unwavering. "If you want to disagree with me, fine. That's democracy. But don't let people like this," she gestured toward Holloway, "feed you empty accusations and expect you to swallow them without question." She turned back to Holloway, locking eyes with him. "If you want to call me corrupt, Mark, prove it. Otherwise, admit you just wanted to put on a show." The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Holloway had nothing, and everyone in the room knew it. The producers in the control room panicked. This wasn't how the segment was supposed to go. The audience had come expecting Pam Bondi to be embarrassed. Instead, she was walking out stronger than she came in. Holloway forced a tight grin, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Well, I appreciate your, perspective," he said weakly. Pam smiled. "Oh, I know you do." A wave of laughter rippled through the crowd. The interview was over, and Holloway had lost. As the cameras cut to commercial, Pam stood up smoothly, shook Holloway's stiff hand, and turned toward the exit. The moment she stepped off stage, a low voice behind her spoke. "That was brutal." Pam turned. One of the network's senior producers, a man who had been watching the show from the wings, was shaking his head. Pam raised an eyebrow. "You expected something different?" she asked. The producer chuckled. "I expected him to get at least one punch in." Pam adjusted her coat, smirking. "He never had a chance." And with that, she walked out, leaving behind a studio that would never forget what had just happened. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge us to grow. What would you have done if you were in her shoes? Let us know in the comments below.